Hugh Kennedy is an influential historian, and he wrote this book, The Prophet and the Age of the Caliphates, the Islamic Near East from the 6th to the 11th century. And in this chapter, The Matrix of the Muslim World, the Near East in the early 7th century, he talks about how the early Islamic empires, they emerged from Western Arabia into Syria and North Africa at a time when two other empires were at war with one another, the Eastern Romans and the Persians. So the reading gets into some of that story. It says here, the Near East on page 1. The Near East before the coming of Islam was dominated, as it had been for the previous half millennium, by two great empires, the Roman-Byzantine to the west and the Persian to the east. Now the Roman Empire was the Roman Empire in the 400s, but again, 476, the western half, including Tunisia and Italy, is conquered by these Germanic kingdoms, including the Vandals and the Visigoths, later the Franks. And historians sometimes refer to the Roman Empire as the Roman-Byzantine Empire, because they want to indicate that in the 400s, even before the conquest of Rome, the Romans had already administratively began to distinguish between the western half and the eastern half. And the eastern half, over time, among historians, comes to be known as the Byzantine Empire. One of the biggest differences was that in the eastern half, Greek was increasingly being used. Greek, which was already a language of learning for hundreds of years, in the 400s, it was increasingly being used in the administration in favor of Latin. And when Rome and Tunisia fall to these Germanic rulers, the eastern half, Constantinople, which controlled Turkey, Greece, Syria, Egypt, the 500s, they just came to be known as the Eastern Romans or the Byzantines. So Roman-Byzantine Empire to the west and the Persians to the east. So he's referring to, the 300s, 400s, 500s. The frontier between these two empires had fluctuated considerably during this time in the last period of stability. So the frontiers, meaning places like Syria and Iraq, Roman Syria and Sassanian Iraq, controlled by the Sassanian Empire, based in Iran and Iraq. They were also known as the Persians. They spoke an ancient variety of Persian language, which is used in Iran today. These empires were fighting in the 200s, 300s, 400s, and the frontier there is basically like Syria, Roman Syria, and then Sassanian Iraq and Iran. And so they would try to take over each other's territories in Syria and Iraq. The frontier between these two empires had fluctuated considerably during this time in the last period of stability. Before the upheavals of the 7th century, meaning the 600s, in the late 6th century, meaning the 500s, the frontier line had run roughly from north to south through the wild uplands of eastern Anatolia, which means eastern Turkey, and bisecting the fertile and well-populated plains of the land between the Middle Tigris and Euphrates River. So here you're heading towards Syria and Iraq. The prairie and steppe country, which the Byzantines called Mesopotamia, which is Iraq, and the Arabs were to know as El Jazira, the island between the two great rivers. On the Byzantine side of the frontier lay the massively fortified town of Amida, now known as Diyarbakir. So you can see here that basically this region here, Eastern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, this was kind of like a frontier between the two empires. That's kind of what he's saying. This is where he points out the south, in the next paragraph, south of the Euphrates, there was no firm frontier. During this is important, the next sentence, during the second half of the 6th century, both the Byzantines and Sassanians had reached agreements with leading clans among the Arab Bedouin tribes, the Ghassanids, the Banu Ghassan, and the Lakhmids, the Banu Lakhm, who provided an element of it. They're based in places like Syria, southern Iraq. These are the people I mentioned who were Christian in the 500s, who provided an element of administration in the frontier areas, as well as defense against their opposite numbers on the other side of the desert. So meaning these Christian Arabic-speaking tribes in like Syria and southern Iraq, they were kind of like an intermediary between, on one side, the Eastern Roman and Persian Empire in the 500s, and then on the other side, the Arabic-speaking trade routes further south going into the Hijaz region. This was where I mentioned that at some point the Banu Ghassan become associated with the Islamic empires, and this now creates conflict between the Eastern Romans in the 600s and the Islamic empires. The Islamic empires, as you remember, conquered the entire Persian Empire of Iran and Iraq. But they only conquer on the Roman side, Roman Syria, they don't conquer, and Roman Egypt, they don't conquer Roman Turkey, also known as Anatolia. In the bottom of the page, in the year 600, the Byzantine Empire presented a superficial picture of ageless continuity. So basically meaning that the Eastern Roman Empire was not as powerful as it used to be in previous centuries. And so he goes into the story of how on page 2 at the bottom, there was the Black Death. So, sorry, up here. In the 6th century saw further blows to the urban culture of late antiquity. Late antiquity means the later centuries of the ancient world. The ancient world ends around the 400s and 500s. When you get to like the 800s, they talk about the medieval world. When you get to the 1500s, they talk about the early modern, and then the 1800s is the modern world. So late ancient is also called late antiquity of the 400s and 500s. Says here in the bottom paragraph, page 2, in 541, the bubonic plague struck the Eastern Empire for the first time, but by no means the last time. So people were basically dying from these diseases. This is where I mentioned that the ancient Sassanian Empire of the 500s, early 600s, they had sophisticated medicine, and in the Islamic world in the 900s in Baghdad also had sophisticated medicine in terms of quarantines and whatnot. And then in the following pages, it talks about some of the things that I talked about with these maps. It also mentions how there were these problems where the Eastern Roman rulers in the 500s and 600s, they had declared the Middle Eastern churches, which is now the Coptic Church of Egypt and the Syrian Orthodox Church, they declared these churches kind of outside of Christianity because they were debating questions about the nature of Jesus. And this was where I mentioned that that the Islamic empires were able to benefit from these political problems because the Middle Eastern churches ended up within the Islamic world, and they were allowed to get more independence in the Islamic world from the in places like Egypt and Syria, from the independence from the Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox priests of Constantinople. And so it talks about here how these empires were fighting, and the Islamic Empire was able to expand partly because of those conflicts. And it gets into the fact that a lot of the administration of the Eastern Romans in Syria and the Sassanians in Iraq became part of the Islamic administrations.